Hello and welcome. This is the adult Sunday school lesson for the First Baptist Church of Alabaster. And Daniel tells me this is our 26th session, which means that we've been doing this 6 months now. Well, this lesson is for September 20th, 2020. This is for our Bible Studies for Life curriculum. And the title of our lesson is Honor Parents. Could be Honor Our Elderly too, and you'll see that as we go through this lesson. We're looking at Exodus chapter 20, verse 12, which is one of the 10 Commandments, and then we'll jump over to 2 Samuel chapter 15, and we'll begin with the 7th verse there. But let's look at Exodus 20, verse 12. Honor your father and your mother, that your days may be long in the land that the Lord your God is giving you. And then we're looking at 2 Samuel chapter 15, and we'll begin reading at the 7th verse and go through verse 14. And at the end of 4 years, Absalom said to the king, "Please let me go and pay my vow, which I have vowed to the Lord in Hebron. For your servant vowed a vow while I lived in Geshur in Aram, saying, If the Lord will indeed bring me back to Jerusalem, then I will offer worship to the Lord." The king said to him, "Go in peace." So that he arose and went to Hebron. But Absalom sent secret messengers throughout all the tribes of Israel, saying, "As soon as you hear the sound of the trumpet, then say, Absalom is king at Hebron." Now with Absalom went 200 men from Jerusalem who were invited guests, and they went in their innocence and knew nothing of what Absalom was planning. And while Absalom was offering the sacrifices, he sent for Ahithophel, the Gilonite, David's counselors from his city Gilo, and the conspiracy grew strong, and the people with Absalom kept increasing. And a messenger came to David, saying, "The hearts of the men of Israel have gone after Absalom." Then David said to all his servants who were with him at Jerusalem, "Arise and let us flee, or else there will be no escape for us from Absalom. Go quickly, lest he overtake us quickly and bring down ruin on us and strike the city with the edge of the sword." Now, as the title suggests, this lesson is based on the commandment that has to do with our fundamental duties toward our parents. Contrary now to many, this commandment was not directed exclusively to children, but had to do with the treatment of elderly parents by their adult children. That doesn't mean that younger children shouldn't respect their parents either, but anyway. Honoring parents had to do with observing praiseworthy family traditions as well as maintaining respectful attitudes toward aging fathers and mothers. Now, Exodus 20:12 reads again, "Honor your father and your mother, that your days may be long in the land that the Lord God is giving you." Now, this commandment was addressing adults, for the most part, who were obligated to care for aging parents. One writer tells us that it was a warning against the heathen practice of abandoning the aged when they could no longer function without assistance. So, what are some of the ways that you can honor your parents? You might say birthdays, anniversaries, don't forget Mother's Day and Father's Day, and those are the obvious. But think of some other ways, if you will. Spending time with them, caring for them as needed, give them a call on the phone, and you can think of other ways to honor your parents or an elderly neighbor. You may want to check out a few websites such as the National Institute of Aging or the National Center of Elder Abuse. On sites such as this, you can find many ways that the elderly are being dishonored. Some examples would be physical abuse, assaults, such as hitting or shoving, but also involuntary confinement is another way to dishonor. Emotional abuse, isolating elderly from their friends or family or keeping them from social activities. Even ignoring an elderly person at a family gathering or even at a church gathering. A study of nursing homes in the Kansas City area revealed that 60% of the residents had not been visited by even one family member in a year's time. 60%. This study was done before the coronavirus pandemic. Financial exploitation is another way that we dishonor elderly. The unauthorized use of personal funds or assets of an elderly person. And just recently, I've been made aware of phone calls to some elderly trying to get information from them, such as Social Security numbers or bank information, to be able to withdraw their funds. Folks like that ought to be put under the jail. That is my opinion. The abuse of elderly parents was a very real issue in Jewish society during the ministry of Jesus. On one occasion, when the Pharisees gathered around him, complaining that his disciples were not living according to the tradition of the elders, because they were eating with unwashed hands. And that's Mark chapter 7, verse 5. Jesus responded by pointing out that they, the Pharisees, condoned abuse far more important to God, the honoring of their father and their mother. The Pharisees were abusing this commandment. They did this by engaging in a deceptive manner that enabled them to avoid supporting their aging parents financially. When a parent would speak to them about his need or her financial need, they would reply, "I'm sorry, but I can't help you because the money I might have given you is dedicated to God." And that was called Corban. Corban. You can look at Mark chapter 7, verses 11 through 12 about that. Now, this commandment of honoring our fathers and our mothers goes beyond showing respect for living parents. Even when parents are no longer with us, we are to go on honoring them. And some people go on honoring, but others dishonor them by the way they live. Now, this commandment also places a responsibility on parents to be worthy of honor, even as they live in a way that honors the memory of their own parents. Think about that. Now, let's go on and look at 2 Samuel chapter 15, verse 7. Now, this is considering the relationship between David and his son Absalom. Now, in verses 1 through 6, we find Absalom was posturing like a king with his chariot, his horses, and he had 50 men with him at the time. He was implementing a plan to win the support of the people and to overthrow his father, David, the king. Absalom placed himself at the city gate to intercept people desiring to appear before the king for the purpose of administering justice. Well, Absalom placed himself there. He did this for approximately 4 years. Absalom did two things to win the people's favor. First, he patronized them by saying their claims were right. You're right, you were wrong in that, and that other person ought to suffer for wronging you. Secondly, he undermined David's credibility by saying the king had no one to listen to them of their concerns. See, the king wasn't at the gate, and he didn't send a counselor down there to listen, but I, Absalom, am here to hear you. By affirming the rightness of their cases and by demeaning the king's ability to administer justice, Absalom gave the men the impression they would be victorious in court if they went before him and if he was the king. Sounds like a bunch of politics to me, but Absalom's willingness to use a smear campaign against his own father was indicative of the poor state of their relationship at the time. Absalom was cementing his strategy by suggesting he could do a better job at administering justice than David. The scriptures tell us that Absalom stole the hearts of the men of Israel. Another step in his plan, Absalom asked permission from David, if you will, we read that in scripture, to go to Hebron. Sounds innocent, but it's not. This was the same city in which David was anointed king over Judah. In order to fulfill a vow, Absalom asked David, I need to go to Hebron, and I made a vow to the Lord to worship him there. And he was asking David permission to go. Now, if you remember, Absalom spent 4 years at the gates listening to people and undermining David there. So, Absalom's slackness in the matter of the vow should have raised questions about his true devotion to the Lord. But if David had any misgivings regarding Absalom's request to go to Hebron, he did not express any. And sometimes we are blinded by our children. My child would never do such. They are angels. Anyway, when in Hebron, Absalom found himself 20 miles away from his father, and he was also protected by the stone walls at Hebron. He then sent secret messengers throughout the people of Israel, in verse 10, making a coordinated proclamation throughout the land. The messengers were to wait to hear the sound of the trumpets and then announce simultaneously that Absalom is king in Hebron. It is basically a call to arms to all those who would support Absalom. Now in verse 11, Absalom had invited 200 of David's most valuable administrators to be his guests in Hebron. They basically became his hostages, as well as removing them from the ability to advise David. Now, Absalom's rebellion also gained an ally in Ahithophel. Ahithophel, the Gilonite. He was counselor to the King David, sort of David's right-hand man, if you will. And some asked why he would have switched allegiances from David to Absalom. Well, Ahithophel's granddaughter was Bathsheba, and David murdered her husband Uriah. That information could certainly have played a role in his decision. Now, in verses 13 through 15, David learned from an unnamed messenger that a coup was underway, and the hearts of the men of Israel were with Absalom. The men that were with David at the time he learned of the coup were dedicated to the king and would have done anything that he called them to do. But David called them to help him take care of his household and prepare us to flee in order to preserve his kingship. Now, this story certainly demonstrates a son dishonoring his father on the grand scale. Now, in 2011, Barna Research did a study claiming that 59% of the young adults with a Christian background now had dropped out of church during their early 20s, their age, early 20s. Now, 8 years later, which would make that 2019, the number of dropouts had increased from 59% to 64%. Now consider, to what extent do you think this failure in Christian discipleship was attributable to a generation of parents or their children? And if so, which generation? Basically, who is to blame? Think about that question. I hope this lesson has been helpful to you. I hope it's encouraged you to honor your parents, and I hope it's encouraged you to show honor toward the elderly around us and respect and show respect to them. I hope it's encouraged you. I hope it's challenged you. I encourage you to go back and pray over these scriptures and to read them again. But let us be reminded that God is with us at all times, even in these very strange days. I pray that you continue to experience the peace of Christ within your heart and life today and the days